Hello and welcome. People are coming in. Great to see you all joining. Just going to wait a little moment as a few more people start to join us here. Hello, everyone joining. We've just gone over the time there now, so I think we'll kick off. Welcome everybody to this webinar on how we can best assist our students with AI bots versus boffins. We've got a really exciting panel here today, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Bidjigal people, beautiful coastal area of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that to respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us here today. Feel free to acknowledge the country that you're coming to us from in the chat if you would like to. First of all, I'm going to hand over to Sue, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the PEAL SIG activities for this year. Over to you, Sue.
Hi, welcome everyone. It's really good to see you this afternoon. 2025 is drawing to a close, and we've had a really good year so far in the PEAL SIG. For me, the highlight was the launch in June of our competency framework. It was a year in the making, well, nearly 2 years in the making, actually, and many of you contributed to the development of this framework. We're hoping that we will be able to leverage this next year to develop further professional development opportunities for you as you learn more about academic language and literacy and how to support our learners with this. In August, my colleagues Chris and Kit delivered a pre-conference workshop on developing critical reading in a Gen AI world. I wasn't able to be at that conference this year, but I've heard really good reports about how well received that workshop was. And today we're wrapping up the year with this panel discussion. So I'm looking forward to 2026. There is a QR code and a Slido that you can use to give us feedback and give us some suggestions for where you would like us to focus in the coming 12 months. We're going to get together later and put a plan together, and your ideas will be really valued. So thank you so much, and I'm going to hand back to James.
Thank you very much, Sue. So I'll get into introducing the panel now. And we're really, really excited to have these three experts with us today. Really appreciative of their time. They're all doing really interesting work within academic language and learning and AI and the intersections between those. I won't read out all of the bios of Andrew, James, and Bianca, but I'll just leave them on the screen for a moment while I just set a little bit of the scope of the discussion, because obviously it's a massive topic, AI, and we're hearing hype from everywhere, and I'm sure, as my social feed is, I'm sure yours is just constantly packed with AI and education. So just to kind of narrow the discussion down a little bit today, obviously we're thinking about you, our audience of post-entry English and academic language practitioners, and trying to frame things towards that. We've called this bots versus boffins, but of course it's not really a debate as such. It's more of an exploration of emerging practice, which is where we're at, I think. Also to mention, obviously, the terms generative AI, agentic AI, LLMs, AI get thrown around and kind of merged a lot. And today as specific as we'll try to be, I'm sure there'll be the points where, there might be a little bit of merging of those. And I think that that's just an acknowledgement of where we are at the moment in the discussion. The last sort of scoping is there are a lot of ways that we can use AI as teachers to boost our productivity, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. But today we're going to focus particularly on learning. And so we're looking at how language learners in particular learn through AI tools, how teachers use AI tools to enhance learning, but also some ways in which we might be trying to enhance learning, but actually that's not what's happening. So that's to kind of focus the discussion a little bit. And I'm just going to stop sharing so that we can see our wonderful panelists. And I'm moving into the first question. And for me, as a practitioner, often I'll go to conferences and talks, and we'll get a lot of kind of frameworks and theories that I am really interested in. But then often once it gets to the audience's turn to ask a question, it is, can you give us an example of that in practice? And so I'm actually going to flip the discussion on its head a little bit, and we're going to start with those examples today in practice. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us 2 examples of AI being used by educators or students for learning English or academic language. One of those which they believe helps the learners, and one of those which they believe might actually hinder learning despite our best intentions. With a caveat that all of these technologies are currently being researched and we don't really have the evidence to definitively say yay or nay. With that caveat in mind, Bianka, I might turn to you first. If you could give us a couple of examples, and out of these, we're going to emerge some themes that we can keep talking about.
Sure. Thanks, James. So I would like to start with what I believe is an effective use of AI by students, and I want to talk a little bit about Cogniti AI. Some of you may be familiar with Cogniti. It's an educational platform that was developed by Danny Liu at the University of Sydney, and it enables teachers to create custom AI agents. So essentially, our AI stunt doubles, and that's with a view of supporting student learning in a controlled and also pedagogically sound way. So the educators at the University of Sydney have been using Cogniti in the last year, experimenting, refining. And I want to share one example of a Cogniti agent that I thought was used really well. This was an agent that was built to help students prepare for interactive oral exams. And we know that interactive orals are relatively new forms of exams. I mean, we've had oral exams, especially in language learning, for many years, but they sort of disappeared, and now they're coming back. And perhaps the structure of an interactive oral is slightly different to a typical oral exam. So that particular agent was prompted to act like an editor of an online magazine that would ask students questions about their essay topic and about their argumentation, how they've been developing their essay. And at any point during the conversation, the student could stop and ask the agent for feedback, and the feedback would be given based on the rubric. So why is it in what way does it help learning? So firstly, it provides great opportunity for practice, a relatively new assessment format. The teacher during the interactive oral actually did assume the role of an editor of an online magazine. So that practice seemed quite authentic. Secondly, that feedback was linked to the rubric. So it was relevant that the information that student was getting was at the right level, pitched according to the criteria. But what is perhaps most important is that this is a Socratic tutor, meaning that agent would never complete the task for a student, would not give student an answer, but would encourage students to submit the answers or to refine based on the questions. So I think this is this is a very important aspect of incorporating any AI tools, is that they need to really help students develop in this Socratic way. So encouraging engagement rather than just providing answers for them.
Mm.
And the ineffective use of AI. So I think I was thinking about it and I thought I want to talk a little bit about teachers using it, perhaps not in a great way. So I've seen some examples of feedback expander tools, which are quite common, used perhaps not in a ethical way. So the idea of a feedback expander tool is great because it is designed to lighten the feedback load. So essentially, we've always had feedback comments, right? That we would perhaps copy and paste and personalize in students' work. So that essentially feedback expander tool should act like that. However, sometimes when teachers upload students' work into that tool and ask it to generate feedback, there is a first of all potential breach of student privacy. There is a breach of really our contract with students, because the provision of feedback is one of our responsibilities as tutors. And of course, when offloading all work, all marking, and all feedback to AI, it doesn't really give teachers any insight into how the students are traveling. So hopefully these are not very common examples, but I've seen those around. So I think it's important to talk about and to talk with staff and tutors about effective and ethical ways of using AI to help with whether it's feedback, whether it's rubric design, or any sort of work that we might have in mind.
Yeah, thank you, Bianca. So many really interesting themes coming out there. Firstly, around the assessment and support for new kinds of assessment. And we're going to come back and touch on that a bit more later. And yeah, lots of, I guess, things to be aware with in terms of feedback expander tools there. And I think, again, something we can dig into much more in terms of good ways of potentially using AI for feedback as well. But I might just turn now to Andrew. So same question to you. A couple of examples, a good and bad, if you like, or one that's going to help, one that might hinder learning.
Thanks, James. There's a few different examples that came to mind when I was pondering this question. One use that I continue to come back to and use it myself is engaging with AI as a tool to unpack new terms or key concepts or new words that you're unfamiliar with. I think it's fabulous as a tool for that purpose, especially for some of the students that I'm sure many of us support, international students, for example, building their academic vocabulary and getting a sense of how different terms, phrases can be situated as they develop their own academic communication skills, but also from a disciplinary context as well. Learning new topics and concepts can be really challenging for many students. And I think AI can be a really good supportive tool in that process. And certainly in my own personal experience, I've used that in topics that I'm exploring for myself, both personally and professionally. So I think that's one way that it can be very helpful as a tool for learning. Thinking about the ways that it might hinder student learning, from my experience, what I'm observing and hearing from colleagues and around the sector is the temptation or an over-reliance on AI as a tool for research, and the ways it can limit opportunities for students to build their own critical thinking, information literacy, and research skills. There's a few parts to that to unpack. The first most critical one from my perspective is an academic integrity related concern, in that there's a risk of using these tools and using the sources that it provides and they not being real, for example, and students being unaware or not fact checking those sources. That's a real academic integrity concern. The second part to that is through an over reliance on using AI to explore a topic in more detail as you start to do research, beyond that sort of first layer of understanding that I was talking about earlier, there's also a risk of relying too much on the AI's summary of a reading or summary of a topic, to the point where the students then intentionally or otherwise, don't engage in some of the subject matter in the core readings or in the textbook or in the lecture notes and things like that. And then through that reliance on AI tools, if I was a student, I'm limiting my opportunities to make my own determination about a source and its strengths and weaknesses, and then how I would build that into my own skills and in my own writing. So there's sort of connected points there. But I think that they're two worth considering. Number one, the ways in which it can be used for introductions to new topics and terms. But then as you develop that further and need to do more research in more detail, there is a risk of over-reliance from an academic integrity perspective, and also limiting the opportunities for critical evaluation of sources.
Yeah, really interesting that question of limiting critical evaluation and developing those critical thinking skills. And maybe as we go through, we might think of ways that AI can assist in developing the critical thing, because that's the claim from a lot of people as well, that that's possible as well. I forgot to mention as we started that there is a Q&A function. So if you would like to post a question, if things start to occur to you as the speakers are talking, please do pop a question into the Q&A and we'll get to that later in the session. Over to James. Same question to you. Give us an example of hindering and helping learning.
All right. I'll start with the bad, perhaps, and end on the positive. I just want to say thank you quickly to University of Queensland for having a room for me to sit in, and thanks for Chris for booking that. I'm actually at the HeadX conference at the moment, so it's great. I've got a space I can do this session in. I haven't ever had to do a presentation while at a conference before, so this is a first. So yeah, bad example. This is a really simple, very basic bad example, but something I see popping up a lot. Particularly with how students are either using it or being told to use it. And often this advice, unfortunately, comes from educators who perhaps just don't know any better. But the issue is brainstorming and note-taking. Now, note-taking is a double-edged sword. I think there's benefits there, which we can unpack later. But for the most part, a lot of these tools that are coming out at the moment, things like AI pendants, which can be great for some people, particularly neurodivergent people who are able to record things and go back to them. But often the issue with using AI to note take is that you don't actually put the ideas together yourself. You're relying on the AI to kind of do that for you. And it ends up almost defeating the purpose of note taking, which is to synthesize ideas and put them together yourself. And I often see that coming up quite a lot as students are sort of pushed towards AI for note-taking. The other issue of brainstorming, I just see coming up quite a lot. And I think some people have been quite vocal about this, of why it's problematic. Again, there are two sides to this. I'm sure there are definitely positives. But if you're starting with a blank page and you go straight to AI, I feel like that's an issue for me. We know that learning occurs when there's friction, when there's some sort of struggle involved, and to sort of switch and offload immediately to an AI tool to say help with an essay before even thinking of what you want to say yourself, I think just offloads too much. And I'm sure there are times when it can be useful, but at the end of the day, I tell my students this all the time. Like I genuinely care about what you think about the world, and I'm more interested in what you have to say about what Piaget says than what Piaget says. And so it's really important to stress that to students, that we do actually want to hear their voice. We want them to take ideas. We want them to not just offload brainstorming to the AI. And obviously there's two sides to that. The positive side, I mean, there's so many positives. Bianka actually stole mine, so I was going to talk about custom GPTs and using them for learning. So I'll use a different one. But the one I really like at the moment is, this has been one of my go-tos personally, and I'm also seeing students use it a lot, is Notebook LM, which is a tool that Google uses. It's, I guess, a multifaceted feature, but really it's the one you may have seen that produces podcasts based on articles and things, which isn't its best feature by any means, but still quite useful. I've actually done a couple of tests with using it for its podcast podcast feature. You can try this yourself. In fact, do please try this yourself. Put in an essay that you've read that you know well, run it through its podcast maker and see what you think. You actually might be quite surprised at the accuracy and the ability of it to kind of synthesize the material within that document. But one of the things that's really exciting about AI tools for me is that students are now able to like create these extracurricular learning sort of resources for themselves. I know with Notebook LM, you can create flashcards, you can create quizzes, you can interact with the kind of the document that you've uploaded or documents if you've got multiple. So another example is you can put like 50 different articles around, the environmental impacts of AI and then talk to the AI about, what some commonalities are amongst those articles and unpack those. And then it can ask you questions about the things that you've discovered in that session. So that's the thing that really excites me about, I think, AI tools is the ability for students not to replace the reading process. Like the idea wouldn't be to just get it to produce a podcast and then listen to that and say you've read the article, but to use it as a kind of extracurricular thing. So you're doing the reading, you're thinking about it, and then you're going to these AI tools to unpack them further, which is often a resource that students may not have access to or something that isn't necessarily provided 24/7. And we do know that, having worked at the Learning Centre for a long time previously, students want after-hours support. They want it in the late hours of the night, when no one's available. And I think AI can help support that sort of need for, wanting to learn after hours when, feedback or support might not necessarily be there. But yeah, those are my two things.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, again, lots of things to pick up on there. I might just jump on that last point about Notebook LLM and the use of it to, I guess, summarize different articles together. And I see a little bit of a tension there with what Andrew was saying earlier about the importance of developing research and summarizing and synthesizing skills. How can those two uses sit together? What's the distinction between using a tool like that when you're improving your critical thinking and literacy skills versus not, do you think? And I'll open this to both of you, Andrew and James.
Oh, okay. I wanted to say something too.
Oh, please, you jump in first, please, Bianca. Go ahead. Please jump in.
No. Well, I just wanted to say while listening to Andrew and James, two things that came to my mind, and that's also in response to your question. That I think a lot comes down to the learning outcomes and what it is that we want students to show in a particular task and what capabilities we want them to develop. So I think that the questions we need to ask ourselves, because we should be directing students' AI use and encouraging them to use certain tools, is when is it good for my students to use AI? And perhaps sometimes it will be good to use the Notebook LLM to synthesize research, but perhaps other times it won't be, because we would like them to, read in depth a particular article and do something with it. So I think it is really important, and it should be guided by what it is that we want students to gain from a particular task.
Just feel free to jump in, Andrew and James.
Yeah, I might quickly jump in there. I think one really important point that James made was the order of events in which you'd engage with an AI tool. And James was talking about the engaging with a reading first and then going to an AI tool to sort of check understanding or check, your own synthesis or summary. And I think that's the right kind of approach, rather than go straight to the AI to summarize a bunch of sources and then rely on that. And it can be a good activity to set for students, for example, that ask them to engage in some kind of reading or resource and then summarize that, and then compare your own summary to the summary that an AI tool provides, and to see how well aligned they are, and does that change your perception of it? And then you've got the opportunity to still develop those skills, but then you're also developing your critical assessment of the AI output and whether or not you agree with their summary or your own summary. So I think that's to some extent resolves that tension that we were talking about, that just the order and the what you do first before you engage with tools. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think so. We're all guinea pigs, right? Like, we don't know what the long-term impacts of using AI are going to be. And in fact, I noticed this early on happening to my own thinking, just to James's point about like the concerns of using an AI tool to synthesize articles and things. Apologies for those that have heard this story. I'll be brief. When I was catching a train home from work after a long day of teaching, and there was a woman on the train who had lost her earpods, like the AirPod things that they use. And my first response was to use ChatGPT to help her find the earpods, because they're like lodged into the side of the seat. And I just sort of caught myself out in a moment of like cognitive offloading. My brain was aware that a solution laid somewhere between me and a device, right? And all I needed to do was pick up that device, and without even needing to think, apart from typing the message, an answer would be given to me. And I met with a student just recently who had this exact same experience, where she was giving some like thoughts on her use of AI for feedback, and how now that she knows that these tools exist, she's often torn between, do I write this paragraph myself, or do I get AI to write it for me? That is a real conflict that students are now facing. They are not just dealing with, the issue of like, there is a mental health crisis, there's a cost of living crisis, there are all these other fundamental issues that really a lot of us as universities aren't really dealing with. And yet we're all, excited about jumping on the AI bandwagon. And I think students are going to turn towards the easy, like the path of least resistance, if those other things aren't in check. And I think that's something we really kind of need to think about and bring into these conversations, is that issue of student well-being, and how, they are being pushed to maybe shortcut certain things, because maybe the learning is difficult. Like, learning's hard when you haven't eaten, or your rent is due and you don't have, you can't afford it, or you're traveling 2 hours to get to your lecture. These are things I think that are under the surface, are things that often get underexplored. And yeah, they're the sort of dangers. So I guess to tie back to an answer to your question, I think we're learning where the dangers are, like in terms of over-reliance, in terms of our mind wanting to cognitively offload stuff. And I think we're developing an awareness of when it's, say, not creating learning, and when it perhaps is benefiting our learning.
Yeah, I think a lot of this reminds me of a recent AI in Education podcast. For any of you who listen to the AI in Education podcast, it's a nice one. I'll see if I can find the link in a minute. They were speaking with Simon Breakspear, and he was using the analogy of taking the stairs versus taking the escalators. And when you're presented with a set of escalators and a set of stairs in front of you, it takes effort to choose the stairs. And as you've pointed out, James, it's not just effort, it's a whole bunch of other external factors, like cost of living crisis, et cetera, that the stresses that our students are under. And, taking the stairs is hard. But how do we encourage students to do that? I guess that's my next question. How do we encourage that hard work when it's not necessarily so, in the example that you gave, Andrew, the order of events: read, then summarize, then ask AI to summarize and compare. The temptation, of course, is to skip to the end. What are some ways of encouraging our students to recognize the value of this kind of hard learning? Jump in, anyone. Yeah.
It's a good question. And I'm not sure that I have the answer exactly. I think we're still, as James was just saying, I don't think we're still figuring some of these things out. Certainly there's something to be said for us trying to articulate and building into our teaching and support for students the reasons why you are coming to university in the first place. Because you can use AI independent of studying in higher education and do that cognitive offloading for many different tasks. So what's the point? Why would we ask you to come to class, and why would we ask you to listen to our advice and direction on building your skills and learning a discipline, I think it's just something we have to continue to emphasize and try to build into all the different activities that we're doing, and wherever possible, link it to the value add or the benefit for a student at the end. So what does their future employment look like if they can do these things? And will that help their future prospects? Continuing to emphasize that and build that into our activities and our assessment tasks, I think is some way that we can go about trying to encourage students to go about the use of AI and learning in the right ways.
I might just jump in there as well. I think I've been thinking that's such a good question. Like, how do we get them to do the learning? How do we show them the value of the hard fought effort of like learning new material in perhaps environments that aren't perfectly suited towards them? I am a big believer in, if as a teacher, if I go into my classes opportunistically excited about what my students are willing to bring, we feed off that. And there is something about building a sort of sense of a learning community within a course that is often very hard to do if your course is, say, 200, 300 students large. Not impossible, but it's easier with like 30 or 50. And I think if you can get students on board, like we did a redesign of a course at UNSW a couple of years ago, centered around the purpose of universities in the age of AI. And it was one of my favorite courses I've ever taught, because each week, like some of the things that we're talking about in class was just sort of happening with the advancement of new tools and new technology. And we decided to really focus on the student voice, and the idea was to produce an assignment that would hopefully be presented to the VC in terms of how the in terms of how the university responds to AI. But the thing about these classes was that students were excited to be there. I was excited to be there. The topic seemed relevant to them and interesting. The assignments were real. And I think there's just something to be said for, encouraging that. That I think our role as teachers is really motivating to learn and building confidence, even more so in the age of AI, where, content can be delivered, on YouTube or wherever, whereas perhaps our role now changes towards motivation to learn. And for me, I look back to and I know we're like moving away from lectures and things, but a lot of my motivation to learn came from sitting in lectures and hearing like a brilliant person speak in front of 100 people about a subject they're passionate about. I remember being inspired by that. So it's a shame that sometimes we move away from that. But I guess the lecture cannot live on in this day and age. But yeah, I think that is a challenge. How do we encourage learning when it's very easy to offload it?
I think if I might just add to what has already been said, I think that idea of creating environments where we leverage AI strengths, but also really focus on nurturing that emotional and community and psychological well-being of our students. And I think there is a potential, if there's more activities with purposeful and conscious AI agents that we direct and we build, and we know that if students are engaging with them, they are actually benefiting the learning, that I would like to believe that it frees a little bit of our time in class for those conversations that are still very, very important. And I think that human aspect of teaching, why students come to university. They come to university, I know, to get a degree, to get a good job, but there's also a group of students that come to build connections, to find who they are, to build their identity. So us helping students with negotiating, who they are, who they want to be, maybe as budding professionals. I think that's very important. That's something that can't be outsourced to AI, at least not at this point. Possibly at some point in time, but I think that's something that's extremely valuable, and that's something to be cherished. And we just need to remember about that value of connection.
Yeah, I love that, leaning into the human and the connection. Just a reminder to everyone, if you would like to ask a question of the panel, there is a Q&A button down the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just click on that and you can type your question in, and we will get to that a little bit later. I wanted to pick up a little bit on something Bianka talked about earlier, which was feedback. We all know that feedback is really important, in all aspects of education, but of course for our language learners. And Bianka, your area of research has been in feedback literacy. I'm interested in those kind of key aspects of developing feedback literacy, and I guess how they have changed and evolved now with AI, and what kinds of advice we should be giving to students in terms of feedback literacy, but also to our fellow teachers in the way that we give feedback now in the context where AI is everywhere.
Yeah, so that is interesting. A few years ago, I wrote a paper. AI did not exist then, or it was just budding. We didn't know about LLMs. It was about how to embed feedback literacy into our programs, and we focused on 3 key skills that we thought are important to nurture and develop in students. That was eliciting, processing, and responding. And I think these skills are still very relevant and important. And AI brings some positive enhancement, but also some potential challenges. When it comes to eliciting, I think it's wonderful to see that with AI available, feedback seeking is so much easier. And feedback seeking is actually a very important capability of feedback literate students. We know that students who seek feedback in the past, it was either we all had students that would come and stay after class and want to talk, and we always cherished and valued such students. This was very precious. So we know that those students that are motivated to seek feedback from teachers, from peers, or now from AI, they are more motivated to then improve their work. So it's wonderful to see those tools there. And we know that students are not intimidated to ask questions. They can ask AI to simplify, rephrase the answers thousands of times, and they might otherwise be perhaps a bit more reluctant to ask this of the teachers. So it's wonderful. When it comes to processing, I think it's a bit more difficult now. And James already mentioned about how little we know about what impact of AI, the interaction with AI has on our cognition. And I think the fear is that it reduces that metacognitive effort or, risks shallow processing. I think they are not unfounded. And the third skill, responding. So I think it's also been mentioned, I think Andrew mentioned, the fear here of students over-relying on AI without engagement. So I think knowing these potential challenges to these processes can also help us plan those student interactions. So I would go back to us making very conscious decisions about how we want students to engage with feedback, and at which point in the course, in the program, are the benefits for engaging with AI tools, at which point are the benefits of engaging with peers or, a little bit of reflective moment. And of course, we have to remember that AI should never replace educators' feedback. So we've already mentioned about that importance of us building students' identity and fostering their evaluative judgment and so on. So I think for me, it really comes down to a very careful planning of the type of interaction, and also communicating that to students. So students need to clearly know why we ask them to, for example, talk to an AI agent at this point in time. They need to understand the context. They need to know how to interact with the agent effectively, and they also need to perceive the value as a learning tool. So these are still the things, these are the pedagogical, the strategies that we've always used with our learning when we were incorporating learning activities that are still very valid. So explaining to students why it would be beneficial to engage or ask for particular feedback at this stage, and what to do with that feedback information. So I haven't talked here about teaching students to write effective prompts That's very important, right? That would be part of their AI literacy, being able to judge the quality of output they get. These are the skills that we've always had to nurture students' evaluative judgment, because they need to be able to assess the quality of the work. So in the past, we used to do it with, look at your peers' work, or here are our exemplars. Whereas now we actually have that repertoire, which is much wider, but the skill is essentially the same. Like, how do you decide? How do you know that this is, that you're getting good advice? Perhaps we know that sometimes that advice might not be what we want it to be, or it might not be positive for learning. So I think, yeah, these are important considerations.
Yeah, really important, aren't they? That evaluative judgment, as you say, this has been something that we've had to teach for a long time, but I think it's just becoming more and more important. And I love the way that you describe the conscious decisions of where to include AI, but also just the importance to actually to make that visible and clear to students as well, why you've made these decisions and how it's going to be beneficial. I wonder, Andrew or James, if there was anything that you wanted to add there in terms of feedback and AI.
I could just add briefly that AI provides a new option for students to collect and engage in feedback. There's still opportunities for students to, depending on the way in which a course or an activity or a class is designed, there should still be opportunities for students to engage in feedback opportunities with their peers and with their teachers, and even critically reflect on their own learning as a source of feedback. So there's a range of different ways in which students can engage in feedback, and engage in feedback as a process rather than a singular moment in time. So I think AI adds another useful source of feedback if it's positioned correctly alongside everything else that continues to be important. That's how I sort of conceptualize AI in this context.
Mm. Yeah, it's like, that's interesting. I do agree. AI is like, love it or hate it, that it does offer incredible opportunities for students to actually dive a bit deeper in their work. And I know I ask, friends and family all the time how they're using AI for, their studies, and a lot of them are using it in more and more nuanced ways. And one of the biggest pickups is the use of AI for feedback. And, people are now, like, they're aware of hallucinations, they're aware of the risks. Like, I was in the cab on the way here actually to this morning, and it was on the radio. They were talking about AI and hallucinations, and how sometimes AI can make stuff up. And so it seems to be entering like the public domain now, like common knowledge, that the risks of these tools. So people have developed the skills in order to use them much more than we had, when they sort of first came out. But one interesting thing that happened recently, some of you may have seen this on Reddit or LinkedIn, but a student had shared a photo of a feedback report that their teacher had given them. And on the feedback report, the first comment was ChatGPT said, and then followed by some feedback that ChatGPT had provided. I think, James, you might be familiar with this as well. And what was interesting about that was it wasn't like the teacher was in any way hiding the fact that they'd used ChatGPT to give feedback. They were openly showing the student that, hey, this is what ChatGPT said about your work. Now, we didn't see what the rest of that feedback said, or if there was like a follow-up with like, here's what I think, or here's why ChatGPT is wrong. It was just a sort of cut off image of ChatGPT said this. But what it did expose, if you go to Reddit and read the threads there, it's always interesting what people really think. Students often feel devalued by the use of AI feedback in their coursework. That's not to say that they don't value it at all. It just means it's less valuable than a teacher giving them real feedback from a human. So the big question for us is, how do we embed AI feedback appropriately at the right times, so as not to devalue the experience that we're offering, which is like, a fairly, intelligent person that knows their field giving advice on a student's piece of work that they've spent time with. That's our real value, one of the many values that we offer as a university. And I think if we sort of lose lose sight of that, it may not really go well in our favor. So yeah,
interesting in that case. I think, as you point out, it's sort of a transparency problem in a way. And I have read some research around when AI use is declared, that piece of writing or whatever is actually deemed as less trustworthy. Whereas, compared to another piece of work which may have had AI, involved in the process, but hasn't actually been declared. So there's that problem of transparency and I guess lack of credibility. I wonder if it's partly, what Andrew said earlier about having different opportunities for feedback, and whether, it's about students seeking AI feedback at times versus, the expectations that, for example, an assessed piece of work is going to be marked and fed back by a human.
I think one of the really interesting things about, in terms of the positives of AI feedback, I don't know if you found this, but like, it doesn't sting. If AI tells you your writing is atrocious and you need to fix, how many adverbs you're using or whatever, it doesn't hurt like a human giving you that suggestion, which is both a good and a bad thing, because we know, with feedback literacy, managing affect is a really big part of that, and that's a skill in and of itself, learning how to deal with a human person giving you feedback. But I do really appreciate the ability for AI to actually, pull apart my work, and for that not to sort of impact my ego. But I've had to make custom GPTs specifically, or prompts specifically to go there. If you simply just say, give me feedback on my work, you're going to get a sycophantic response of how amazing your work was and how it's worthy of a HD. Whereas if you actually really push it to say, like, no, I want you to be critical, I want you to be honest, I want you to be truthful, don't hold back, be brutal if you must, like those sorts of instructions can really help the kind of the criticality of the AI's response.
Yes, it tends to be sycophantic when I when I use it. But yes, you gotta push for that honest feedback. There's a question from Joe in the Q&A. Thank you for that. It's a good one, and I'll put it to the panel. What are your thoughts on students with learning differences and how AI can be an equalizer, allowing these students to do things that would otherwise be challenging or overwhelming? Just throw that open to the panel. Who'd like to jump in?
I think what comes to mind for me is the multimodal support that AI offers. So presenting information in different formats, whether that's in text or visuals or some interactive simulations that can perhaps allow students to choose the mode that works best for them. I think that those tools that change text to speech and so on, and they allow students then can listen to that instead of reading, can be quite helpful.
Absolutely. I think we're finding that with students with English as an additional language as well, like the idea of translanguaging, which is an interesting subject, being able to jump in between their native language and the additional languages when perhaps the concepts are getting too difficult, or perhaps there's just wanting to, that familiarity can actually be useful in certain instances. And I don't know many tutors personally that can speak multiple languages, in a way that is consistent and very reliable. So it is an incredible tool in some ways that we have access to, an AI that can, in some instances in voice mode, that sounds very much like a human voice, talk in multiple languages at the click of a switch, and interact with students back and forth. And we know, I'm glad that question was raised, actually, because often in these sessions we do talk about a lot of the negatives because they're important to discuss, but AI has become an accessibility tool for many students. There are many students that are using the accessibility features of AI and its multimodalities just to really enhance their learning experiences and to help them with their studies. And I think that in itself, I think justifies their existence. The fact that they are able to help some students navigate the difficulties of university, because it can be a lot for most students. University is a very very interesting landscape. Lots of things to kind of get familiar with. All the different software that we give them and all the different tools that we're pushing down, in that direction. It can become quite overwhelming. But yeah, the ability for AI to kind of help students through that sort of, even that first year in particular, can be really, really beneficial. And is one of the good use cases, I think.
Yeah. Anything to add, Andrew?
No, I don't think so. I think that captures it quite well.
I just want to dive back into, again, something Bianca mentioned earlier. You talked about Cogniti and its use helping people prepare for interactive oral exams. And I think this is a really interesting area where we can use AI tools to help students, but also the way that AI itself is making assessment types change, and the interactive oral is obviously, probably one of the most prevalent of those that I've heard about. Bianca, you're at Sydney University, where they have the famous two-lane approach to assessment. I'm sure probably most people on the call are familiar with what that is now, but maybe if you could give us a quick little rundown of the lane 1 secure, lane 2 open assessments, and then what does this mean for supporting students, particularly students who have English as an additional language, in both lanes, and preparing for these new assessment types?
Yeah, great. So the two lanes or Sydney assessment framework is the main purpose is to assure both integrity and relevance for our degrees. So when we think about assuring integrity, we are thinking about secure assessments. So these are the assessments in which AI cannot be used, or it can be used if it's directed by a tutor. So for example, if AI tools are part of the rubric or the course learning outcomes. But essentially, other than that, we have a secure environment where we can then assure that what the students can meet the course learning outcomes. So in secure assessments, we're talking about interactive orals, viva voces, pen and paper exams, handwritten exams, lab experiments, any sort of environment where the teachers can see the students perform the task without the help of AI. So that's assuring integrity. And then we've got the relevance, so making sure that our degrees are relevant so that we prepare students that are workforce ready, so they need to have AI skills. And this is where AI cannot be prohibited. So students can use AI if they want to. The tutors cannot prohibit the use of AI. And so here we have all the other groups of assessments, a lot of written tasks, essays, reports, but also creative tasks, and a whole suite of open assessments. And so here the assumption is that students, these are more formative assessments. So this is where we provide feedback for learning, whereas the lane 1 are summative assessments. We are assessing student learning. So in terms of what this means for students with English as additional language, I think when it comes to open assessments, this is where they can use any tools they want. If they need to use a translation tool, they can use it as long as they acknowledge. So it's our policy now that AI needs to be acknowledged in open assessments, and they need to explain how they've used this particular task and at which point in the assessment that was used. When it comes to secure assessments, for example, interactive orals, we know and we hear from academics, especially in cohorts where there are a big number of international students, that students are stressed, they panic before interactive orals because first of all, they haven't practiced enough, but second of all, that their language skills are not perhaps good enough. So again, it all boils down to learning outcomes. So that the Cogniti agent that I mentioned at the start, this particular agent was not really the student proficiency and grammar correctness and vocabulary was not part of the criteria. So in this way, the international students were in no way disadvantaged. We were not assessing their proficiency, language proficiency, but the tutor was looking at how they are able to modify the response or modify the essay and so on and so forth. So I think really depending on what it is that we need to grade. I understand that there will be some contexts where we have to look at students' language proficiency. Of course, there will be where we need to know at what level they are. And so then the criteria will need to reflect that.
Mm. Yeah, Andrew, you're president of AALL, and a lot of the work that learning advisors do is support students in preparing for assessment and building the skills. Are you seeing changes in the way that students are needed to prepare for these new types of emerging assessment types?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a piece of work for professional development more generally for learning advisors as we're seeing emerging tasks be set, because as learning advisors, we might not have had that experience in completing those tasks ourselves before. When I went through university, I wrote a lot of essays and I wrote a lot of reports and those kinds of things. They're going to be situated much differently to the students that we have now. I didn't have to complete a portfolio or do many vivas, that kind of thing. So there's certainly some work in general that I think learning advisors continue to upskill in, and an important part of that is working collaboratively with academic staff to understand the scope and the purpose of the task, and then we can advise and support students in that as best we can.
James, how about you? Supporting students for new and emerging assessment types. You seeing anything interesting in that space?
Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate between the Viva and the an interactive oral presentation. But I definitely see benefits in obviously the use of questions and answers in a presentation format, assuming that the assessments prior to that have led to that moment, and there's been feedback in place to support, like Bianka was saying, the student leading up to that moment. I think they're fantastic ways to really assess a student's knowledge, and we're actually seeing that a lot of these assessments are becoming like lane one or hurdle tasks or whatever you want to call them, as sort of stopgaps for ensuring students have done the learning. And we know TEX is really big on assuring learning has occurred, whatever that means. But I think it's important to also realize like where the technology is going. How long are we going to be able to secure interactive oral assessments before we have to sort of pat down students before they enter the room to make sure they're not wearing an earpiece, or Meta Ray-Bans, or contact lenses with augmented reality, which may sound like science fiction, but these are technologies that NASA and other programs are working on. So it's almost like a never-ending cycle of the snake eating itself, trying to catch students cheating, and the technology develops and we continue playing catch up. But I do wonder, is there a limit on the ability of fanning out the AI from these secure tasks? But I'm a big fan of interactive roles. I think they're fantastic at this stage, while we can assure that AI isn't involved in the process of actually delivering that style of presentation.
All righty. Well, gosh, time has gotten a little away from us. I would love to talk to you all day, and I'm sure the audience would love to hear much more from you. But unfortunately, we are almost at a close. I want to say a huge thank you again to Andrew, Bianka, and James for your time today, sharing your expertise with our SIG. We really, really appreciate it. James, you mentioned before your response on the train when someone dropped their AirPods and you turned to AI, and I think you had a no AI December as a result last year. Are you going to do that again this December?
Yeah, thanks, James. Funny, thanks for the plug. Yeah, we are running No AI December this month, in December, sorry, which is just a month of, if you're wanting to take part, abstaining from the use of generative AI tools, to help reflect on the process of what it means to write and think in the age of AI. So if you do want to be involved, go to the No AI December website. And if you'd like, you can be part of the study. We're going to do a study of participants who basically haven't used AI for the month and seeing what the results are of that. So yeah, do go visit the website and sign up.
And while I'm plugging things, Andrew, love to plug the AALL conference, which is coming up soon. And I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting things around the themes that we've been talking about today. When can people go along, and what should they do, Andrew?
Yeah, we're about a month away. I'm really excited for the conference. I think Sue's just put the link in the chat if people are interested in looking at the schedule and registering. There's still time. A lot of great presentations focused on many of the topics we've been talking about today. So I'd really encourage people to come along if they're able and interested.
Fantastic. And then one last thing is I'm just going to share a QR code here for the upcoming English Australia EdTech Symposium coming up next week. So if you're interested in what we talked about today, get along to that and be involved in much more. Thank you again to our panelists, and a big thank you from our PEAL-SIG conveners. Sue, would you like to have any last words before we say goodbye for the year?
No, other than Stacey's iPhone would like to know a bit more about James's website. So if maybe James could pop that into chat. But listen, thank you very much, and thanks for running today's session, James. We'll see the PEAL-SIG members again in 2026. And do check out the All conference because I think it's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and yeah, we'll see you next time.